Do you believe in forgiving or forgetting?
My mom wasn't the kind of woman who handed out rules just to feel in control. She wasn't overly strict, she didn't track my every move, and, honestly, she was the type to give me a lot more freedom than most of my friends had. But there was always one rule, one ironclad, never to be questioned line I was not allowed to cross under any circumstance, and that rule was this: I was never to go inside Olivia's house. Not for a birthday, not for a ride home, not even to use the damn bathroom. And when I say she was firm about it, I don't mean the usual "I don't like that family" vibe. I mean she looked me in the eye, more than once, and told me with a tight jaw and a sharp voice, "You stay away from that man. I don't care if the house is on fire, you wait outside." And the thing is, I believed her. Not because I understood, but because she said it with this energy that made it feel like something serious, even dangerous, would happen if I didn't listen. So I didn't. For years. But as I got older, I started to wonder. Olivia was my best friend since second grade. Her dad, Alan, was the kind of guy everyone liked: funny, charming, owned his own small business, coached Little League even though he didn't have a son. He was the type of guy who waved at neighbors and handed out full-sized candy bars on Halloween. From the outside, his life looked pretty perfect. He and his wife seemed happy enough, Olivia adored him, and even my teachers liked him when he showed up for school events. So, the fact that my mom hated him, not just disliked, but hated, was confusing. And when I was young, it was easy to assume that maybe my mom was just jealous. She worked 2 jobs, was tired all the time, and raising me alone couldn't have been easy. But there were moments that didn't fit the jealous mom theory. Like the time I snuck into Olivia's house for 5 minutes because I forgot my backpack after school. My mom didn't even yell when she found out. She cried. Not loud, not dramatic, but I saw her sitting on the edge of her bed, holding her head in her hands like someone had just died. And I remember asking her what was wrong, and she just said, "I told you not to go in there," in this empty, exhausted voice, like she'd given up on something I didn't understand. She didn't punish me. She didn't raise her voice. She just looked defeated. Over the years, I asked a few times why I wasn't allowed over. Each time, I was shut down fast. The answer was always some variation of "he's not who you think he is," or "you'll understand one day," or just a cold stare and silence. Eventually, I stopped asking. But I never stopped wondering. And honestly, I started to resent her for it. Olivia and I remained close, but there was always this gap in our friendship. I couldn't sleep over, I couldn't be there for birthday parties, and every time she asked why, I had to lie and say my mom didn't like sleepovers or some other dumb excuse. And the older we got, the more obvious it became that I was the weird one. The one whose mom had this bizarre, secret vendetta against a man who, by all appearances, had done nothing wrong. By the time I was in college, I had mostly moved on from it. My mom and I were on decent terms, though not super close, and I only saw Olivia during holidays or breaks. Our lives had drifted a bit, like most childhood friendships do. But the weird tension never left me. And every time I visited home and drove past Olivia's old house, I felt this strange mix of guilt, anger, and curiosity. So when I ran into Alan at a fundraiser 2 years ago, totally by accident, I knew right away who he was. And even though I had told myself I'd never get involved, I walked up to him and said hello. He recognized me immediately. Smiled, said, "You're Rachel, right? Mary's daughter." I nodded, and for a second I saw something in his face, something like recognition, maybe even sadness, but it vanished so fast I wasn't sure I hadn't imagined it. He was warm, polite, exactly like I remembered him. We talked for maybe 10 minutes, mostly about Olivia, how she was doing, where she'd moved. He seemed genuinely happy to hear I was still in touch with her. And then, right as I was about to walk away, he said something I wasn't prepared for. He said, "You know, your mom and I, well, it's complicated." I always felt bad for her, though. She was in a tough spot. It hit me like a punch in the chest. What the hell was that supposed to mean? I asked him, flat out, what kind of tough spot? And he just smiled and said, "It's not my story to tell. But I think if you ask her now, maybe she'll be ready." That night, I called my mom. I didn't mention the conversation. I just asked, why did you hate Olivia's dad so much? There was silence. Not awkward silence, cold silence. And then she said, I told you a long time ago, you don't need to know. He's not who you think he is. Leave it alone, Rachel. But she didn't sound angry. She sounded tired. Like I'd reopened something she'd spent years trying to bury. And that's when I knew. Something big had happened. Something she didn't want me to know. Something that went way beyond overprotective parenting or jealousy. She wasn't protecting me. She was protecting herself. I couldn't stop thinking about it. That one sentence Alan said, she was in a tough spot. And the way my mom responded when I brought him up, it wasn't fear, and it wasn't anger. It was shame. And once you recognize shame in someone, you can't unsee it. That was the moment I decided I wasn't going to let it go. And that's when I remembered something. There was a storage box in the basement she told me never to touch. One of those old banker boxes, taped up with a Sharpie label that just said, "Do not open." I'd seen it 100 times and never thought much of it. Until now. Because if you spend your entire life being warned away from one man, one house, and the person doing the warning looks ashamed instead of scared, you start to wonder. What if the truth wasn't that she was trying to protect me? What if she was just hiding something she hoped I'd never find? I didn't sleep that night, not because anything actually happened, but because I couldn't get the look off Alan's face out of my mind. That strange half-smile he gave me, like he knew something I didn't, something he wasn't supposed to say, but had decided to hint at anyway, lingered in my thoughts like a ticking clock I couldn't silence. And the worst part was, it didn't feel like some creepy older guy making a weird comment. It felt like someone trying to hand me a truth wrapped in so many years of silence and damage that even he didn't know where to begin. I just kept hearing his words over and over again. I always felt bad for her. She was in a tough spot. And I kept thinking, what the hell kind of tough spot could explain 2 decades of bitterness, warnings, and emotional landmines that turned my childhood friendship into the shadow of something I was never allowed to fully have? What kind of tough spot makes a woman so terrified of a man that she bans her daughter from entering his house, yet at the same time so afraid to talk about it that, even as a grown woman, I couldn't get a straight answer? The next morning, I told myself I wouldn't go digging. I wasn't going to fall into some rabbit hole chasing ghosts. But 5 minutes after that lie, I opened my laptop, searched for Olivia on Facebook, and sent her a message. It had been a while, maybe a year since we talked last, but our relationship was always the kind that could survive long silences. She answered almost immediately, and after a little small talk I said, "Hey, this is kind of random, but I ran into your dad last night." I didn't want to be dramatic about it, but I needed to know if she knew anything at all. She wrote back, "Oh, funny. He told me. Said he saw you and asked how you were." Then she added something that stopped me. He said it was weird. That your mom probably wasn't too happy about it. LOL. I stared at that message, the way people stare at fire alarms just before they go off, knowing something's about to explode. I asked, "Did he ever tell you what happened between him and my mom?" She replied instantly, "Not really. I think they dated a long time ago, before my mom. I only heard little things. He said she kind of lost it when he got married. But he never said much. Just always told me to be kind to you, that your mom was going through stuff." I sat there, phone in my hand, heart pounding like I'd just opened a door I was never supposed to even look at. If Alan and my mom dated, and if that relationship ended badly, then what the hell was the real story? Because the way she reacted anytime his name came up wasn't the behavior of someone mad about an old breakup. It was deeper than that. It was raw, unresolved, like something had never healed because it was never even allowed to scab over. That night, I couldn't stop myself. I brought it up again with my mom. This time, I didn't ask gently. I walked into her kitchen while she was doing the dishes and said, "I talked to Olivia. She said you and Alan dated. Is that true?" Her hands froze mid-wash, and for a few seconds she didn't say anything. Then she looked at me, not with anger, but with this deep, worn-out expression I can only describe as exhausted disgust. Not at me. At herself. At the conversation. At the fact that I wouldn't let it die. She said, "Rachel, I told you to leave it alone. You don't know what he did." And I said, "Then tell me." Her jaw tightened. Her fingers gripped the edge of the sink like she needed something solid to keep from falling. She didn't scream. She didn't even raise her voice. She just said, "He ruined a lot of people. Not just me." When I asked how, she turned her back to me, rinsed the plate she was holding, and muttered, "You'll think I'm crazy." "You already do." I didn't say anything after that. I just walked away. But in my head, something had shifted. I knew now, without a doubt, that whatever happened between them was real and ugly and unfinished. And I also knew that if she wasn't going to tell me, I was going to have to find out on my own. That was the moment I remembered the box in the basement again. The one she warned me not to open. The one that sat on a shelf for years, untouched, unlabeled except for the black marker scrawl that said, "Do not open." I had seen it every time I dug through the holiday decorations or went looking for old school supplies, but I had never actually opened it. Part of me had assumed it was full of old financial documents or maybe just junk she didn't want to deal with. But now I wasn't so sure. Because the kind of person who tells her daughter for 2 decades to stay away from a man, and then refuses to explain why, and then tells her she wouldn't understand even if she knew, well, that person has something they don't want you to find. So that night, after she went to sleep, I went downstairs, pulled the box off the shelf, and brought it to my room. It was lighter than I expected, which somehow made it feel even more ominous. I opened it slowly, half expecting it to be empty or full of irrelevant nonsense. But what I found made my stomach turn in a way I hadn't felt since childhood. Emails. Printed out. Dozens of them. Maybe more. Neatly stacked, chronologically organized, most of them marked with highlighter or underlined with red pen. Some pages had sticky notes on them, others had corners bent with ink smudges from what looked like water damage or tears. I didn't even know where to start, but I started reading anyway. The sender, Alan. The recipient, my mom. The subject lines didn't say much. Things like, "Please read this," or "We need to talk," or "You're making a mistake." But the tone was desperate, intimate, sometimes angry. These weren't work emails. These weren't friendly exchanges. These were personal. And about halfway through the first dozen, I realized what I was reading. These two had a full-on relationship. And not just a casual, summer fling kind of thing. It went back years before Olivia was even born. The early emails were sweet, affectionate, the kind you'd expect from two people who thought they had a future together. But then the tone changed. Somewhere around the middle of the stack, things got darker. The messages started referencing arguments, decisions, pressure. Alan begging her not to go public with something. My mom accusing him of abandonment. Accusing him of cowardice. There was mention of a pregnancy. Then silence. Then, finally, a single email that stopped my heart. "I did what you asked. I made the choice. You promised you'd be there, and then you weren't." I couldn't breathe. And then I saw the very last one in the pile. It wasn't sent. It was a printed-out draft. The subject line read, "I'll never let her know what you did." And suddenly, all those years of warnings, all those rules, all that silence, it wasn't about me. It was never about keeping me safe. It was about keeping herself hidden. And in that moment, sitting there on my bedroom floor, surrounded by 2-decade-old heartbreak, betrayal, and secrets, I realized that my entire childhood had been built on a lie so deep that even my mother couldn't tell the truth anymore. Not even to herself. But I was going to get it out of her. Even if I had to rip it out piece by piece. I don't think I fully understood the kind of damage silence can do until I sat on the floor of my bedroom, surrounded by piles of paper that had been hiding in our basement for what must have been close to 2 decades, slowly realizing that every word I read was undoing something I thought I understood about my family, my childhood, and especially my mother. For most of my life, she was this emotionally controlled, sometimes overcautious, but mostly practical woman who didn't talk much about the past and had this ability to compartmentalize everything difficult. But here, on paper, she was someone entirely different. She was vulnerable, volatile, desperate, angry, and terrified, sometimes all in the same email. And the more I read, the more I felt like I was eavesdropping on a version of her that I had never met, but who had clearly shaped the one I did. The emails told a story that didn't come together all at once. They unraveled in pieces, like pulling threads from an old sweater until the whole thing starts falling apart in your hands. At first, I thought maybe it was just an old flame that ended badly, and the bitterness my mom carried was her way of dealing with being abandoned or betrayed, which would have been hard but understandable. But then I started picking up on things that went way beyond a broken heart. References to what we did and how we handled it started appearing over and over again, usually in Alan's replies, and the tone in his messages began to change from charming and apologetic to manipulative and guilt-laden. One message in particular hit me like a brick. It said, "You knew what it was. We weren't teenagers. We made adult choices. You don't get to rewrite it now just because you feel bad." That was when I realized that whatever happened between them, it wasn't just about a failed relationship, it was about something serious, something that left behind guilt that never went away. And then came the pregnancy. At first, I wasn't even sure that's what they were talking about because my mom never mentioned having a miscarriage or an abortion to anyone as far as I knew, but the references were there, subtle but unmistakable. Alan said, "You told me you were keeping it, and I didn't run. I offered to help. You're the one who flipped everything on its head and made me into a monster." And her reply, dated just a week later, said, "You offered to help once it was too late. Once the appointment was made. And then you disappeared. Don't pretend that makes you a hero." That was when I had to stop reading. Not because I didn't want to know, but because my stomach physically couldn't handle it anymore. I put the papers down, stood up too fast, stumbled into the bathroom, and threw up. Not because the idea of a pregnancy was shocking in itself. I'm 32. I'm not a kid, but because I realized that this entire time, I had been blaming my mom for being cold and secretive and controlling, when in reality, she was someone who had been carrying the kind of trauma that no one helped her process, that no one even knew existed, that she locked up in a cardboard box and shoved in the basement because she didn't know what else to do with it. And then came the part that really twisted the knife. I found a small envelope tucked in between two email printouts, handwritten, with my name on it. Not Rachel, as in, not addressed to me as her daughter, but just R, like she couldn't bring herself to spell it out. I opened it, expecting maybe a note or something private meant for me, but inside was a printed email draft. It had never been sent, never replied to, and from what I could tell, never even shared. The subject line was simple: "If she finds out, I lose her." And the email itself was short, almost fragmented, but devastating in its honesty. It read, "I don't know how to tell her that the man she adored from a distance, the one who hosted the birthday parties and gave rides to everyone else's kids, was once mine, too. That I thought we'd build a life. That I ended a pregnancy because he promised we had a future, and when I did, he left. That every time she asked me why I hated him, all I could hear in my head was the silence. That followed when I needed him the most. And that was the moment I stopped feeling angry and started feeling something I didn't expect, betrayed, yes, but also deeply, painfully sorry. Not just for what happened to her, but for the fact that she never got to be honest about it. She had to bury it all, literally and emotionally, and instead of working through it, she built a wall between me and the person who caused it. And in doing so, she built a wall between us, too. Because no matter how much she tried to keep Alan out of my life, the gap she created with her silence made me resent her instead of understanding her. But that sympathy didn't last long. Because the more I sat with it, the more I realized that keeping a secret like this, no matter how painful, wasn't just about protecting herself. It was about controlling the narrative. She didn't tell me because she didn't want me to see her as someone who made mistakes, who trusted the wrong person, who walked into something she couldn't handle. She wanted to keep her dignity intact, even if it meant manipulating me into thinking there was danger where there was none, even if it meant making me feel like she was doing it for my sake, when really, she was doing it for hers. And the worst part was, she never planned to tell me. That much was obvious now. The printed emails weren't saved out of guilt or a desire to eventually come clean. They were a time capsule of rage and regret that she kept because, in some twisted way, it helped her hold onto the version of events that let her stay angry. She wanted to remember every betrayal, every cruel word, every promise broken so that she wouldn't forget why she left, why she cut ties, why she made sure I never set foot in that house. It wasn't about healing. It was about punishment. But I wasn't going to let that be the end of it. I couldn't. Because if I had spent my entire life living under the shadow of this secret, if my friendships and my childhood and my entire view of who to trust had been shaped by a story that had never been fully told, then I at least deserved to hear it from her mouth. Not through old emails. Not through someone else's memory. But from her, face to face. So I put everything back in the box, except for the letter with my name. I kept that. And then I sat in the dark, waiting for morning, already planning exactly how I was going to make her talk. Because the time for asking was over. Now she was going to tell me, whether she wanted to or not. When morning finally came, I didn't feel rested or ready or even entirely clear on what I wanted to say, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I wasn't going to spend another day tiptoeing around this secret that had been rotting in our family like a buried body no one wanted to exhume. I had spent too many years carrying the confusion, the resentment, and the emotional fallout of something I wasn't even allowed to understand, and now that I had seen the truth with my own eyes and read it in her own words, I couldn't go back to pretending her silence was noble or protective or even justified. I knew I couldn't just throw the box at her feet and demand answers, because she would shut down, retreat into that cold, defensive shell she had perfected over the years, the same one she used every time I got too close to asking questions she wasn't ready to answer. But I also knew that if I didn't confront her now, in the light of everything I had read, I would lose any remaining chance of hearing the truth from her mouth before it disappeared behind another 2 decades of deflection and revisionist history. So, I waited until she sat down with her coffee, just like she did every morning, scrolling through her phone like the world outside our kitchen didn't feel like it was about to implode. I sat across from her, calm but direct, and I didn't ask her if she was ready to talk or if it was a good time or if she wanted to revisit the past. I simply said, I opened the box in the basement, and I read everything. So now it's your turn to stop pretending and tell me the truth, all of it, because I'm done living inside your version of silence. She didn't flinch, didn't look surprised, didn't even react in any big emotional way. She just set her cup down a little too slowly, placed her phone face down on the table, and stared at me like someone who had been waiting for this moment, but still hoped it would never actually come. For a long time, she didn't say anything, and I let the silence hang there, refusing to back off or soften the demand, because I knew if I gave her even a second to slip into denial, the conversation would be over before it began. Finally, she said, without looking at me, so you read everything? I nodded and then added, including the draft. The one addressed to me. That changed something in her face, not panic, not shame, but this deep, exhausted kind of resignation that almost made me feel sorry for her. She leaned back in her chair, crossed her arms like she was bracing herself against a storm she couldn't stop, and then, for the first time in my life, she started telling me the truth. She told me that she met Alan when she was 23, working a front desk job at the same company where he was quickly climbing the ladder, already married to someone else, already charming, already the kind of man who could convince anyone of anything, and that at the time, she believed everything he told her, every lie about how he was going to leave his wife, how they were meant to be together, how she was different from every other woman, smarter, more grounded, the kind of woman he could build a real life with. She said it started with coffee breaks and long conversations, then turned into late-night phone calls, then hotel rooms, and before she even realized how deep she was in, she had already built this fantasy in her head of a future that never actually existed. And when she found out she was pregnant, she expected him to step up, to prove that all his promises weren't just empty words, but instead, he panicked, told her she was overreacting, said they needed to slow down and think rationally, and that he wasn't ready to be a father to a child outside of his marriage. And when she told him she wasn't interested in slowing down, that she was going to keep the baby with or without him, he started turning cold. Not violent, not abusive, just calculating and distant, like he had flipped some internal switch and decided that she was now a problem to manage rather than a person he once claimed to love. She said that the worst part wasn't even the abortion itself, which she went through alone in a small clinic without telling anyone in her family, not even her sister, but the weeks that followed, when Alan stopped returning her calls, blocked her email, and left her in a state of grief so complicated and buried in shame that she didn't even have the vocabulary to explain it to herself, let alone anyone else. She said she stayed in that job for 6 more months, just long enough to save enough money to leave town, and when she heard through mutual friends that Alan's wife had given birth to a baby girl, Olivia, less than a year later, something inside her cracked in a way that never fully healed. She told me that seeing Olivia grow up, becoming my best friend, being pulled into my life despite every effort she made to avoid it, felt like a cruel joke from the universe, a constant, breathing reminder of everything she had lost, everything she had given up, and everything she had never been allowed to mourn properly. And when I asked her why she never told me any of this, why she let me grow up confused and angry and shut out from my own history, she just said, "Because I didn't want you to see me like that. I didn't want to be the woman who got used and discarded. I didn't want you to grow up thinking your mother was weak." And those words hit me harder than anything else she said, because it wasn't just about her past, it was about the way she carried herself every single day of my childhood. The way she worked 2 jobs without ever complaining. The way she never cried in front of me, never leaned on anyone, never admitted when she was scared or lonely or overwhelmed. She had built an entire identity around not being weak, and in doing so, she had erased one of the most defining chapters of her life from both our memories. I didn't say much after that. I didn't yell or accuse her or tell her how much it hurt to realize that she had been keeping this from me for so long. I just sat there and listened, and somewhere in the middle of it, I realized something that changed everything about how I saw her. She hadn't just been hiding the truth from me. She had been hiding it from herself, too. Because facing what Alan did, what he really did, meant admitting that she had trusted the wrong man, given too much, lost something she could never get back, and then spent the next 20 years pretending that decision was justified, that silence was strength, and that fear was wisdom. But I wasn't going to carry that lie with her anymore. I had one more question before I walked away from that table, and I asked it without hesitation. Do you regret it? Not just the relationship, or the abortion, or the silence, but all of it? Do you regret letting him walk away without ever holding him accountable? She didn't answer right away. She just looked at me, her eyes full of something that felt like grief mixed with pride, and finally, she said, "Every day." That should have been enough. But it wasn't. Because knowing the truth is one thing. Living with it is another. And after what I read, after everything I heard, I realized there was still one person who hadn't been forced to live with what he did. Alan. And that was about to change. There's a certain moment that comes after the truth has been dragged out, pulled from dark corners, ripped out of people's mouths with resistance and shame, where the silence that follows feels almost heavier than the lie itself, like now that everything's out in the open. Everyone's just sitting in the wreckage, trying to figure out who they are without the stories they told themselves for years. After my mom finally spoke, after she said the words that had sat inside her like a rotting weight for over 20 years, I didn't feel peace, and I definitely didn't feel healed. I felt something else, something colder, sharper. A kind of focused rage that wasn't loud or chaotic, but slow-burning and surgical, the kind of anger that doesn't want to scream, but wants to correct something that has been broken and left unrepaired for too damn long. What kept circling my mind, over and over again, was how Alan had lived his life untouched by any of it, how he had gotten to move on, to marry, to have Olivia, to raise a family, to host birthday parties and be the good dad in the neighborhood, while my mom had to uproot her life, hide in shame, and carry a loss so personal and devastating that she couldn't even tell her own daughter about it without falling apart. And I wasn't interested in revenge in the theatrical sense. I didn't want to ruin his career or slash his tires or start shouting family secrets to the neighbors. What I wanted was something deeper, more permanent. I wanted him to feel what it was like to be looked at without the comfort of being misunderstood, to have the mask peeled off in front of the people who thought they knew him, to be forced, even if only for a moment, to sit in the discomfort he created. So I came up with something that, at first, felt too bold, maybe even cruel, but the more I thought about it, the more right it felt. I invited Olivia and Alan to dinner. Nothing dramatic, no fancy excuse, just a message to Olivia saying I was back in town for a bit, wanted to catch up, had been thinking about the old days, and thought it would be nice to see both of them. She said yes without hesitation, sweet as ever, probably excited to reconnect after the emotional whirlwind of our last conversation, and when I told my mom what I had planned, what I needed her to be there for, she stared at me like I'd gone insane. And then, without argument, just nodded. She asked me only once, the night before, "What are you going to say?" And I told her, calmly, "I'm not going to say anything. I'm just going to show them." When they arrived, everything felt too normal, too calm, like the air hadn't realized it was about to be torn apart. Olivia hugged me, Alan shook my hand. My mom played the part of polite hostess so well you'd think she'd forgotten how much she hated him. We sat, we ate, we talked about harmless things for maybe 20 minutes, and then, just as Alan was telling some story about a fishing trip he and Olivia had taken the year before, I stood up, walked to the kitchen counter, and brought over the old cardboard box I had been keeping behind a cabinet. I placed it on the table, right between their plates, and opened it slowly. Then, without a word, I pulled out a stack of emails, thick and slightly yellowed from time, and dropped them in front of Alan. The sound of paper hitting wood was louder than anything anyone had said all night. I didn't look at Olivia. I didn't look at my mother. I just looked at him, and for the first time, I saw something in his eyes that I had never seen before: fear, not the kind that makes a man panic, but the kind that makes him freeze. I said only one sentence, quiet but clear. "You can read it out loud, or you can sit here in silence and let her read it herself, but either way, she's going to know what kind of man you are." And then I walked away. I left the room and sat in the hallway, just around the corner, close enough to hear the shifting of chairs and the occasional sharp intake of breath, but far enough away that they had to sit with each other and the ugly truth between them. No buffer, no escape. For nearly 10 minutes, there was nothing, just silence, the kind that feels like pressure building in a room where everyone's afraid to move. Then I heard Olivia say quietly, "Is this true?" And Alan didn't respond, at least not right away. Eventually, I heard him mutter something about it being complicated, about how it was a long time ago, and then I heard her voice again, firmer this time, shaking but steady. "You got her pregnant and then left? You let me grow up thinking she was the problem." I don't know what he said after that, because I stopped listening. I didn't need to hear him stumble through some justification or watch him try to twist the past into something manageable. The damage was already done. The truth was already out. For the first time in his life, Alan had to sit across from two women he had tried to forget, tried to reduce to a series of regrets and rationalizations. And he had to look them in the eye as the carefully constructed version of himself cracked open under the weight of the truth. Eventually, I heard a chair scrape, footsteps shuffle, and Olivia walked out, past me, out the front door without saying a word. My mother didn't follow her. Alan didn't try to stop her. They just sat there, trapped in the wreckage of what they had built or destroyed, depending on how you looked at it. Later that night, after everyone had left, my mom came into my room and sat on the edge of my bed. She didn't say thank you. She didn't apologize. She just said, "You did what I never could." I didn't ask what she meant, because I already knew. She had spent her whole life running from a truth she thought would destroy her if she looked it in the face, and I had forced it to sit at her table and stare her down until she stopped flinching. I haven't heard from Olivia since. I don't know if I ever will. I imagine she needs space, and I'm not going to chase her or try to explain why I did what I did. I know it hurt her. I know she probably feels betrayed and shattered and confused, but I also know that she deserves to live in the truth, not in the curated version of her father she was handed. As for Alan, I don't care what he does now. Whether he tries to justify it, bury it again, or spin it as some sad misunderstanding, it doesn't matter. He had his moment. He had to sit there and face it. That's more than he ever expected, and far more than he deserved. And my mother, well, she's quieter now, not in the distant way she used to be, but in a way that feels like someone trying to figure out what's left of themselves after the storm passes. I think she's still angry, maybe not at me, but at how long she let herself live in fear of being seen. But I also think there's a part of her that's lighter, like by finally telling the truth, she let go of something that had been eating her alive for half her life. As for me, I don't know what this all makes me: brave, vindictive, honest, cruel. It probably depends on who's telling the story. But I know this. I didn't destroy anything that wasn't already broken. I just opened the door and turned on the lights. And if that makes me the villain in someone else's version of events, then so be it. Because at least I finally got to live in the truth. Even if it cost me everything else.